Thank you.
Thank you. We were so worried about not going over time, I did something that I haven't done in years. I wrote my text out and Googled how many words is 20 minutes. So I hope I don't speak too slow or too fast. Thank you. Thank you. Oki niksukuex, itamixistikoi, nistuanakok pitaki. I would like to acknowledge that we are not only on Blackfoot land, but that we are also all speaking English in the territory that used to belong to the Blackfoot language. What I'm going to share with you about the Blackfoot language is the result of talking to and working with a lot of Blackfoot people, and is also the result of years of studying the structure of the Blackfoot language using Western methods of linguistic analysis. It is my hope that my presentation will show that these methods can shed some light on the genius of Nitsipochs in the Blackfoot language. On this slide, you see a map of the language families spoken in North America. Pretty astounding variety, 12 distinct language families in Canada alone. Blackfoot belongs to a family that we call Algonquian. Oops, goes too fast. Wow. Hold on. How do I go back on this thing? It seems to only go forward. Can I get help?
Is that back?
No, it's only going forward. All right. Can we do it manually?
Slide 4.
There we go. This is good. So there is a large project out of Carleton University that is working on literally putting these languages on the map. And we are very proud to have contributed Blackfoot to this work here. So you have here Siksika, Genee, and Piikani dialects. We don't yet have the Montana dialect, but so we now have 400 phrases in each of these dialects. You can click on it and hear actual Blackfoot. On this slide, you see a map from a recent article in Canadian Geographic. The size of the circles indicates the number of speakers that each language still has. The smallest circle indicates less than 10 speakers, and the largest up to 5,000. So even the big circles represent fairly small numbers. Almost all Canadian Indigenous languages are now endangered, as most of you, I'm sure, know, many critically so. Those of us who are settlers, scholars, and educators are slowly coming to grips with our complicated historical and contemporary roles in these processes. On the one hand, educators and scientists were complicit in attempts to eradicate Indigenous cultures and languages. On the other hand, early travelers, settlers, and scholars are also responsible for some of our earliest records of Indigenous cultures and languages. And some of that work is now also being used, weirdly enough, to help stabilize and reclaim languages, some of which no longer had speakers. There's a famous recent example that we're all very proud of the work of Berkeley linguist David Costa. He described the Miami language, which no longer had any speakers. It's mainly spoken in Illinois and surrounding states. And this has allowed a small community of activists to reclaim their language, which had no speakers at all left. So there is now a very small group of second and first language speakers of the Miami language again. Linguists used to largely accept as fact the idea that Indigenous languages were going to pass away. So they just started to attempt to record as much linguistic material as possible before the languages would go out of use, which they thought was inevitable. This kind of salvage linguistics creates a written record, but it doesn't in and of itself preserve a language as a living, breathing thing that people use to communicate. For that, we need speakers. If speaker numbers are already in decline due to massive transition to colonial languages like English or Spanish, then we need to find ways to help communities teach the language to children and adults, and to reestablish domains in which the language has been lost. The most important of these domains is the home. No language can be fully preserved by teaching it in the school system. I think it's always very important to realize the limitations to what you can do in schools. It doesn't matter how brilliant your teaching methods are, how brilliant your curriculum is, how you have a full immersion system, schools cannot compete with the home. when it comes to saving languages. Most Blackfoot children are now no longer acquiring Blackfoot as their first language in the home. There are some that still do, but many do not. And very often their parents and caregivers are also not fluent and are not able to speak the language with their children even if they wanted to. So many people will therefore need to learn the Blackfoot language as a second language before they can themselves help to bring it back into the home for the babies of the future. This requires work in the school systems to teach the language, and it requires the universities also to do their bit by establishing post-secondary degree programs in Indigenous languages and teacher training programs that train Indigenous language teachers. Local on-reserve schools in the various communities around us are working very hard to provide Blackfoot language education, but most of these programs are underfunded and under-resourced compared to the funding available for Canada's official languages. Post-secondary institutions also lag behind in responding to the language-related calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and the most important one from my point of view I've put here. So I'm just gonna pick on the University of Lethbridge here, but the University of Lethbridge stands for all universities in the country. Here, for instance, we have 5 full-time professors of French, but Blackfoot is taught by sessionals, 1 course per semester, if that, people without any job security or professional development opportunities. So if every post-secondary university would commit to hiring at least as many professors for their local Indigenous languages as they do for French, or if we're in a French part of the country, as they do for English, surely not unreasonable, then we might have a fighting chance to be able to turn out suitably fluent and properly pedagogically trained Indigenous language teachers to help support language learning at the K-12 levels. When doing language revitalization and maintenance work, the gold standard for many people continues to be the creation of fully fluent native speakers who can and do use the language in everything they're doing, from telling their kids to get out of bed in the morning to writing their PhD dissertation. In many cases, such a result is not realistic, and people sometimes have to settle for other, more modest, more reachable goals. So for instance, someone who no longer speaks their Indigenous language might be satisfied if they are able to say a prayer in Blackfoot, or to participate in an important ceremony using the language. Or somebody, one of my students, one of my Blackfoot students, is really happy when her little nephews can correctly respond to some simple commands in Blackfoot. She finds that really empowering. That's how she communicates with them, tries to do it a little bit in Blackfoot. And many people also find it empowering to understand important concepts from the Blackfoot culture that are expressed in unique ways in the language. And so in the rest of this talk, I'm going to discuss some of the ways in which the vocabulary and the grammar of the Blackfoot language can help us to understand Blackfoot ways of viewing the world in the way that they're kind of baked into the language. And at the same time, I'll try and point out how linguistic analysis is often able to elaborate on ideas about the language that are expressed by fluent speakers. So one thing that fluent speakers very often say is the Blackfoot language is very descriptive. I started to work on Blackfoot about 15 years ago, and I thought, what is it they mean? When they say that, they must mean something, because everybody says it all the time. This often comes up in the context of new words for new things or new concepts. So many Western languages will simply borrow words for new things from other languages, but Blackfoot and many other Indigenous languages prefers not to do that. Instead, they prefer to create a new word by recombining existing Blackfoot elements. And such neologisms often reflect how their creators conceptualize the essence of a new object or a new concept. So you have all seen these signs in the library. A few years ago, Martin Heavyhead made Blackfoot words for some of the signs around the library, and I give them here to you with the translation, but also with a more literal translation that appears when you separate the word into its meaningful elements, which is, you know, a thing that linguists like to do. So Martin's rendering of the word for university library literally means we find there things that are new. Isn't that exactly what a library does? So we discover this by splitting the word up into its individual meaningful parts, which we call morphemes, and that's what you see on the second line. So the first line is just the words as they're written. The second line takes that word apart into each of the pieces that have meaning. And then the third line kind of gives a gloss to each of these pieces. So some of this is really technical, and especially the abbreviations in capitals, you can ignore those. But if you just focus on kind of the words that are in small letters, you get an idea of how a word like that is built up. And Martin also translated General Services Desk. This is very beautiful. This literally means the place where we sign out books. That is exactly what a General Services Desk is. And he also translated Information and Research Assistance Desk, but I think he thought it was a little bit long. He thought, really, it's the help desk. And so he translated it as, we get help there, the place where we get help. This is where you get help. That's exactly what that is. So if you paid attention, you maybe saw that these words reveal a kind of a template that Blackfoot often uses to create new words for locations. And so the template structure is basically, we verb there, a place where we verb, stick in the verb into that template. So you put an actual verb in that template and you can make lots of new words, such as a word for school, which is, I'm going to try and say this word, where we learn. Isn't that exactly what you do at school? And the very important word for the Blackfoot culture, namely Walmart. Walmart is the place where we gather. Old word for Walmart. So this is only one of the many different template structures that Blackfoot uses to create new words, but it allows the language to avoid having all these loan words from other languages. So another nice example here is the word for stirrup. I always have to sneak something in about horses into everything, sorry. So the word for stirrup literally means a tool for placing your foot into, that which we use to put our foot into. That's exactly what a stirrup is. You put your foot into it so you can be more stable on your horse. Many words for plants and animals are also formed in this way that describe some kind of significant feature. So this is a horned owl. This is from our online dictionary. Literally, if you take that apart, it means he has meager ears, thin ears, right? So horned owl. And then there's other words. If you've ever tried to learn Blackfoot, you learn that the word for skunk is literally white stripe. It's not exactly what a skunk is. It has a white stripe over his head. There are all these really descriptive words. That's what they are. They're descriptive. Sometimes these words give us an unexpected view of earlier colonial times. So a good example is the names of the days of the week. These were clearly introduced after colonization. The Blackfoot didn't have words for days of the week, and they reveal the influence of the church and the Indian agent on reserve life. So some of these words also differ between the various communities, depending on how the week was structured there. So the word that literally means the day on which we get our rations, first of all, tells you that rations were handed out once a week, but I have been told on Pikani that refers to Tuesday, and on Kana that refers to Thursday. So that shows you rations were handed out on different days on the reserve. And then I particularly also love the word for Wednesday, which means literally when it is half closed, and this refers to some of you, if there are any old-time Lethbridge people here, they will remember that the stores used to be closed on Wednesday afternoon. And the Blackfoot word for Wednesday refers to that. Something else that people say all the time is the Blackfoot language is action-oriented. I have heard many versions of this. It's usually used to contrast with English, which is said to be object-oriented and to have more nouns than verbs. And this is also definitely something that is confirmed by linguistic analysis. And I used it, call it for myself, kind of unofficially, the dances with wolves effect. Because if you, well, it depends on how old you are. If you remember the film Dances with Wolves, then you know that Kevin Costner's character is given a name that describes an action that he always does, namely this thing that he does with these wolves, which looks a little bit like dancing. So, some of these examples already that I've given already show this, but here's another one. This is the word for radio, which literally means the thing with which we listen loudly, like radios can make louder sounds than human voices. And this kind of structuring does not just apply to nouns, but also sometimes to verbs and even to old verbs, where if you take them apart into small pieces, you see that there's tiny little kind of metaphors or other actions embedded in them. So in this case, this is from the time before there were bathrooms or even outhouses, and people simply went outside to do their business. Euphemisms for bodily functions occur in all languages. And so in the pre-plumbing days in Blackfoot country, going to the bathroom was literally referred to as taking yourself outside, going outside. And now if you add an extra causative morpheme to that, you get to cause someone to take themselves outside. And that then has the idiomatic meaning to give somebody a laxative, which would certainly cause you to have to go outside, right, if you don't have a bathroom. And just recently, a Blackfoot person told me that a more recent euphemism is, I'm going to check on my horses. And I like that one because it involves horses. Relationships are the most important thing in life. Is also something that people say all the time. And this includes relationships with people, especially family, but also animals, plants, creator, spiritual beings, the land, elements in the landscape, and all kinds of what we would consider to be objects. Now, Blackfoot has a special way of treating nouns that designate important relationships. The vast majority of these nouns behave a lot like English nouns and just refer to all kinds of objects and concepts, but there is a small group of nouns that we call relational or dependent nouns. And most of these refer to kinship terms. They essentially designate a relationship between two entities. So in Blackfoot, a word like mother, in English too, implies the existence of a child. And so therefore, essentially, it establishes a relationship between two human beings, a mother and a child. And so it is inherently relational in a way that a word like woman is not. So Blackfoot reflects that in the grammar by treating these nouns differently. And in Blackfoot, in particular, they cannot occur without a possessor. So in English, you can talk about a mother or a child, but in Blackfoot, you always have to say whose mother, whose child. So you can say his mother, her mother, our mother, my neighbor's mother, anybody's mother, but you always have to express the relationship with the child. You can, of course, also mark possession on non-relational nouns, but then it's optional, it's not obligatory. And the possessive prefixes, this look here like n, they have a different, slightly shorter form when you use them with relational nouns. So in this next slide, I'm going to let you take a look at this while I talk about the rest of these things. So this gives you just a section of some of the verbs that we have in our dictionary that express things that have to do with how important relationships are. So such a relationship between, or distinction between relational and non-relational nouns is in fact quite common in many languages of the world. It's in and of itself not exotic. But what is interesting is when non-kinship nouns are sometimes also included in the category of these relational nouns. So our online dictionary allows us to sort entries by word class, and when we look at relational nouns, we see that there are 45 items, and these include all the kinship terms and some other relational words referring to things like neighbor, boyfriend, roommate. But interestingly, there also is one animal word, one word for one animal. Which one do you think it is? Which animal in Blackfoot is so important that it is like a family member? You might think it is the word for dog, since dogs have been so important to Blackfoot culture since the dog days. So it is perhaps a little bit surprising, but I like it because anything about horses is better, that it's not imita, the word for dog, but a special word for horse, which is otas. And it's often translated as someone's horse, the horse of someone, or your mount or your saddle horse. So when you ask Blackfoot speakers for the word for horse out of context, they'll usually give you ponokamita, which means literally elk dog. And people will explain this word was given to horses because a horse combines the speed of an elk with the usefulness of a dog. And that's exactly what it is, right? But when you want to talk about a horse that you have a bond with, like your horse that you ride, as opposed to, one of the animals in your herd, then you call it notas, my mount, my saddle horse. And from that noun, you can then also derive a verb that means to own a horse. So here, I would like to suggest the inclusion of one animal in this very restricted category of relational nouns tells us something really interesting about how important horses were to Blackfoot society once they arrived on the Western Plains and were integrated into the culture. And if you're interested in this, John Ewers wrote a beautiful book about the importance of the horse in Blackfoot culture. I'm almost there. This is something that people also say all the time. The language is the culture. You cannot separate it. Now, we were explicitly asked today, me and Kevin, to talk about language and culture and about the relationship between language and culture. And I used to think about language and culture and cognition as essentially separate things. And I would always very strongly object to even weak versions of what some of you know as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or linguistic relativity, which states that language affects cognition and affects culture. However, recent experimental research into linguistic relativity by such scholars as John Lucy and Lara Boroditsky is beginning to show that language does influence thought in small but non-trivial ways in specific domains. But what I have noticed in talking to Blackfoot people is that they often don't even accept the premise that language and culture and thought are different things at all. To them, you cannot think in a Blackfoot way if you do not know the Blackfoot language. The best thing, of course, is to speak it fluently. But if you are not lucky enough to speak it fluent, you can still learn about Blackfoot values by learning about the words that express those Blackfoot values. And I've just given you a sample of, there's different lists of Blackfoot values depending on who you talk to, but this is just one of them that's often said to be really important. So I hope to have shown you that you can learn something about Blackfoot ways of looking at the world by paying attention to the structure of the language. Thank you.